الطرب يحلاله العيد هالهلاله والله كل الطرب يحلاله يا ربنا زيد النعم يا ربنا زيد النعم حسن جميع الحالة حسن جميع الحالة.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here, and thank you in particular to Hisham and to the Center for Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law for hosting me here today. It's a real pleasure to be here at Stanford to present my book, particularly because it's also published by Stanford University Press. So it's a real honor to be here with you today. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what I do in this book, and then I'm also going to be focusing a lot of my discussion today on things I talk about in my conclusion, which brings the discussion more focused into the present day. So I'll give some historical background, but I thought that might be of more, particular interest here in this setting. So last month, and please let me know if I'm blocking the images, but last month, an article in Foreign Policy by its CEO and editor David Rothkopf described Dubai in the following way, quote, "Sitting on the 51st floor of the Emirates Tower, it's possible to imagine you're floating above the Emerald City of Oz. The soaring towers of the city evoke a sense of tomorrow in a way that no city in the Western world can rival. In fact, it's really only this city that suggests the kind of promise, daring, and innovation with the same twisting, glistening vibrancy." He then quotes the UAE's Minister of Cabinet Affairs, who, looking down from his office window, says, quote, "I remember when the country was founded in 1971, traveling down that road, but it was not a paved road back then. We had to travel it in a Land Rover," end quote. This kind of primitive to progressive, medieval to modern, barren desert to emerald city kind of depiction of Gulf cities is not new. Kuwait began the process of rapid oil urbanization in 1950, decades before its now more popular southern neighbors. In 1983, the British architect Stephen Gardner wrote the following about Kuwait, quote, "There was no breathing space between ancient and modern, rags and riches. From a tiny place in the sand on the edge of the Gulf, Kuwait hurtled like a missile into the high technology of the mid-20th century. And over the next 30 years, the new city of Kuwait, optimistic, imaginative, confident, and utterly modern, was conceived, planned, built, replanned, and rebuilt. The unique creation of oil, the story of this city is astonishing," end quote. This discourse certainly captures the ambitions and intentions of state-led urban planning projects, but it fails to reveal the real-life experiences of the diverse people who live in these cities, nor does it take into account the often unintended outcomes of such radical and rapid urbanization. So my book aims to challenge this very uncritical, simplified, and linear rags-to-riches narrative of Gulf cities that permeates both scholarly and public discourse today. And what I show is that the process of oil urbanization in Kuwait was not as smooth and heroic as it's often depicted. I begin my study of Kuwait City from the time of its settlement in 1716 through 200 years of city growth before oil and end in the present day, with the focal point of my analysis being the period from 1950 to 1990, so the first decades of oil. And a Kuwaiti government publication commemorating 25 years of independence in 1986 referred to this time as Kuwait's modern era. And indeed, the period of state-led urban planning that began in Kuwait in 1950, 4 years after the first barrels of oil were exported, echoed the discourse of the early to mid-20th century European high modernist avant-garde led by the French architect Le Corbusier, who believed that modernist architecture and planning could and should be used as instruments of social change. So the goal was to build cities in a way that would generate more orderly but also ideally more egalitarian societies. Now, while most societies in which such modernist planning principles were deployed in the middle of the 20th century did change dramatically, often the changes were not those that modernist planners or the state officials who hired them initially intended or anticipated. And this was certainly true of Kuwait. Kuwait's modernist project was launched with the accession to power of Abdullah Salem in 1950. And the ruler's stated goal was to transform Kuwait into the happiest and, quote, the best planned and most socially progressive city in the Middle East, end quote. So in true modernist form, the ruler thus connected urban planning with social progress. State-funded welfare in the form of education, healthcare, housing, employment, coupled with urban development, so infrastructure, wide streets, luxurious houses, modern buildings, These would all relieve Kuwaiti society of the hardships of the past and create a more egalitarian, thriving, and content citizenry. Now, that was the goal that was first conceived 65 years ago. So, did we succeed? Is Kuwait today the best planned and most socially progressive city in the Middle East? I, like many others, argue absolutely not. In fact, Kuwait today is in a state of both urban and social crisis. So the city itself is plagued by chaotic buildup, severe traffic congestion, shoddy construction, and rapidly obsolescing buildings. And it's also a highly segregated and privatized city, with more and more shopping malls and other spaces of consumption replacing every last shred of public space. Now, the social crises are even more concerning. Like elsewhere in the Gulf, the majority of Kuwait's population consists of non-citizens, roughly 70%. But the country is becoming more and more xenophobic every year. As mass deportations and the systemic abuse of foreigners consistently intensify, inhumane laws are regularly passed that make it increasingly difficult for Kuwaitis and expatriates to coexist. So, for instance, in a very sort of apartheid-esque move, state hospitals are segregating timings and services between nationals and non-nationals. In 2013, a reader's poll in a travel magazine ranked Kuwait the world's 5th unfriendliest city. Riyadh in Saudi came in at 15th. While in 2014 and 15, Kuwait ranked as the worst place for an expatriate to live out of 64 countries. Now, within the citizen population, deep social cleavages between groups like the Hadar, who are the former townspeople, the sedentary urbanites, and Bedouin, and between Sunni and Shia, are exploding on the political front. I mean, this is a picture of our Sunni and Shia MPs sort of duking it out on the parliament floor. And as I touch upon in the introduction of my book, violence is becoming more widespread. From the fatal stabbings of numerous young men in shopping malls over trivial fights with strangers, to violent brawls between gangs of Kuwaitis and Egyptians in suburban neighborhoods, and from the burning down of a campaign tent of an anti-Bedouin parliamentarian to armed clashes between political protesters and the government's special forces. So this is hardly the happy, content, progressive populace that Abdullah Salem envisioned 65 years ago. So to understand how we reached the state we're in today, my book goes back in time and retraces our steps to the present. What I ultimately argue is that with the coming of oil in the middle of the 20th century and the concomitant advent of state-led modernist planning, Kuwaiti society lost what the Greek architect George Candilis, who worked in Kuwait in the late 60s, called its primordial quality of urbanity. For more than 200 years before oil, Kuwait's urban landscape evolved naturally to meet the everyday needs and desires of its inhabitants and users. The climate, coupled with the fact that most daily activities were structured around prayer times and that there were no street lamps in use at night, made it essential that work, home, mosque, and spaces of leisure and commerce were in close proximity to each other. As a port town, the markets, seafront, and harbors were the centers of the town's mercantile and maritime economies. But they were also the main spaces of social exchange and political discourse. So this spatial integration of the different functions of city life stimulated a vibrant everyday urban experience characterized by diversity and simultaneity, in that multiple things happened in the same space at the same time, spontaneity and possibilities for the unexpected, and a constant engagement and interaction with difference. As a port, Kuwait was a cosmopolitan place, which, as Rhodes Murphy argues, quote, does not necessarily mean sophisticated, but rather hybrid. A port city is open to the world, or at least to a varied section of it. In it, races, cultures, and ideas, as well as goods from a variety of places, jostle, mix, and enrich each other and the life of the city, end quote. Foreign travelers to Kuwait before oil regularly described the town as a friendly and accommodating place whose residents were, quote, tolerant to others and not overly rigid to themselves. So that was from 1903. And they were also described in the 19th century as closely united and free from feuds and factions. Both of these outsider observations were corroborated by practically every Kuwaiti I interviewed that was alive before oil, regardless of background. Now, although this might be read as a romanticized, nostalgic view of pre-oil urban life, there was actually a pragmatic basis to the townspeople's outlook and behavior. So in a highly competitive region where ports regularly rose and fell in commercial prominence, Kuwait had to be a place that people from other regions like India and East Africa wanted to trade with. So they had to be open and accommodating to strangers. And as for the second quote, their unity, life before oil wasn't easy. The climate was harsh. Most people were poor. The sailing and pearling industries required most townsmen to be out at sea for most months of the year at a time. And the financial dependence of the rulers on the town merchants resulted in a complete absence of a bureaucratic state. And these realities created a complex urban life that necessitated the creation of formal and informal networks of cooperation and mutual support among and between the townspeople. For instance, urban neighborhoods were perhaps the most important source of everyday moral and material assistance, serving various public functions such as sanitation, security, education. And the urban quarters in Kuwait were not organized along class or ethnic lines. And so the strong bonds that existed between neighbors, born out of pragmatic strategies of survival rather than any idealized sense of neighborliness, went a long way to creating a sense of communal solidarity among the townspeople that cut across their many ethnic and religious differences. And indeed, the sense of community was not based on any idea of a shared cultural identity, but rather formed out of the everyday concrete interactions people had with one another within the dense urban landscape. So oil was discovered in 1938 and the first barrels were exported in 1946. And the sudden affluence that came with oil dramatically altered Kuwait's urbanity and transformed both the city and these social conditions. As I mentioned, in 1950, Abdullah Salim launched a massive new welfare system that not only served to distribute the oil wealth among the people, but also augmented the power of the rulers by making the entire citizenry dependent on the government rather than on each other for their material well-being. And state welfare removed that perpetual state of need that had connected people together in their everyday lives before oil. Meanwhile, a nationality law passed in 1959 made access to Kuwaiti citizenship and the newfound wealth that came with citizenship extremely restrictive, imposing new barriers between nationals and newcomers and new divisive hierarchies within the citizen population. And this new homogenized definition of Kuwaiti national identity fostered a different sense of social relatedness among Kuwaitis, one based not on their shared experiences with one another, but rather more simply on their perceived similarity as Kuwaitis, and on their shared privileged status vis-a-vis foreigners, who again constituted the majority as of 1957. In 1964, less than 15 years after the advent of oil, Fakhri Shihab, who was the economic advisor to the ruler, wrote that the most serious danger resulting from oil wealth was that, quote, the new citizen is content to enjoy a life of leisure and inertia. Protected, pampered, and lavishly provided for, and accountable to no one, he lives in a world of make-believe, end quote. Affluence was rapidly making Kuwaitis more insular and, he worried, more concerned with personal prerogative than with public good. And this was exacerbated by the fact that the new city that was produced after 1950 hindered people's ability to engage in the kinds of everyday interactions and unexpected encounters with different people and experiences that were commonplace before oil. By 1950, it was clear that the old walled town was no longer capable of accommodating the demographic boom the country was experiencing. So in 1951, the government commissioned a British town planning firm to create a master plan to transform Kuwait into a modern city. And the plan conformed to modernist city planning principles that were prevalent in the UK and Europe at the time. So it emphasized the separation of activities into discrete functional zones with new residential suburbs. So this is the old city center here. These are new city suburbs, residential suburbs here built in the desert outside the town wall, and also separate sectors for industry, education, health, and then also here a different commercial district. While the old town center was almost entirely demolished and replanned to become a financial and bureaucratic city center. So in sharp contrast to the mixed-use nature of the pre-oil townscape, urban life in Kuwait became highly differentiated and separated out into discrete spheres. So people went to work in the city center, spent their leisure time along the coast, shopped in the new commercial district of Salmiya, and went home to rest in the suburbs, and moved between these spaces entirely by private car. And in this new fragmented and increasingly privatized everyday life, people's encounters and interactions with difference rapidly decreased as they withdrew into more self-contained and self-sustaining suburban lifestyles. Meanwhile, new state housing policies after 1950 deliberately segregated the population into discrete residential zones. So the townspeople were relocated to lavish suburbs bordering the city center. The sedentarizing Bedouin were settled relegated to these large housing projects in what were known as al-manatiq al-kharijiyya, or the outlying areas. And non-Kuwaitis, who began migrating to Kuwait in the tens of thousands from 1946 onwards, were sequestered to crowded commercial areas and rented apartments due to their inability to own land in Kuwait. So these different areas became restricted enclaves whose residents' everyday interactions and public encounters with different groups from outside their own social world significantly diminished. So for instance, in a social residential survey conducted by the municipality in 1969, 78% of the polled residents of Shamia, which is one of these inner suburbs here, where the former townspeople lived, so 78% said they did not interact with non-Kuwaitis, while 83% of Hawalli's expatriate residents said they did not mix with Kuwaitis. This was by 1969. In 1982, the Kuwaiti social geographer Abdul Rasul al-Musa found that such extreme social segregation imposed, quote, severe social barriers inside the Kuwaiti community that were dangerous and ominous for the future well-being of the state, end quote. And 35 years later, we see that he was right. As for the city center itself, once it was vacated of its inhabitants, the government commissioned an endless line of planners, foreign planners, consultants, architects, and transportation experts to come up with plans to organize and reorganize Kuwait's primate city throughout the 70s and 80s. However, although the areas outside the old town wall were developed according to plan, no plan for the city center itself was ever successfully implemented, despite all the time, effort, and expense that went into producing them. And this was mainly due to high levels of corruption, a chaotic planning system, and exorbitantly high land values that made city development extremely unprofitable for the state and for the private sector. I can elaborate more on that later. Aside from the construction of some commercial and state buildings, particularly after the 73 oil boom, large portions of the city center remained vacant and undeveloped well into the 1990s. Lack of off-street parking created severe traffic congestion, and open spaces and sidewalks were used as spontaneous car parks, inhibiting their public usability and the city's general walkability, problems that persist today. Also contributing to the city's rapid decline was the fact that many important uses that had shaped everyday urban life before oil had been removed from the city throughout the first 3 decades of modernization, such as residence, shopping, leisure, and even the port that had formed the town's identity before oil. All that remained were banks and financial organizations, ministries, offices, a couple of new shopping plazas and hotels, and the old market area. So the result was a city center that was entirely, almost completely dead after working hours. The development boom that oil triggered slowed down in the 1980s, and then the Iraqi invasion and occupation of 1990 to 91 marked the official halt in the process of oil urbanization that began in the 1950s. And so Kuwait faced a development lull for most of the occupation decade as matters of security, national defense, and post-war reconstruction became top priority. And so it was not until 2003 that things began to change. Regime change in Iraq put Kuwait in the clear, while a surge in oil prices coupled with the influx of foreign, mainly Western residents due to the high military, contractor, and business presence across the border, triggered the country's second major post-oil construction boom. Now, other Gulf cities like Dubai came of age during Kuwait's hiatus of the 1990s, and so after 2003, Kuwait attempted to make up for lost time. And so, for instance, in 2004, the municipality exponentially increased floor area ratios in commercial areas, allowing buildings to rise up to more than 70 stories, depending on plot size. So glass and steel high-rises housing luxury offices began to rapidly replace the characteristic low-rise modernist architecture of the 50s and 60s. And shopping malls and luxury hotels and resorts have constituted a major component of the new construction craze, wiping out Kuwait's few remaining public and mixed-use area like this old outdoor commercial residential strip in Salmiya that, since the 60s, had served as Kuwait's main shopping district, but is now being demolished and replaced by malls. So Through such modernist urban planning, Kuwait's inhabitants have lost what the French urban sociologist Henri Lefebvre refers to as a right to the city. Now, a right to the city is not just about a right of access to the urban center and its various spaces and resources, although centrality is of course important. But a right to the city also entails the right to participate in a vibrant urban life, which, echoing Lefebvre, I define as a lived opportunity for spontaneous encounters and confrontations with different people, ideas, and ways of living, combined with the simultaneity of everyday functions and activities in the city. Decades of urban planning, suburbanization, and the economic and cultural privatization of urban space transformed the patterns and practices of everyday life in Kuwait and, I argue, replaced the openness, tolerance, and mutuality of Kuwait's pre-oil urban society with the insularity, xenophobia, and divisiveness that characterize social relations today. Like the city itself, Kuwaiti society has lost its primordial quality of urbanity. The Kuwaiti scholar Khalil al-Janfawi claims that the high levels of intolerance that Kuwaitis today exhibit for people of different religious and cultural backgrounds, quote, he says, goes against our tradition and actually undermines our historical achievements, end quote. He laments that many of his fellow citizens view the diverse foreigners residing in the country as threatening rather than as enriching to their own culture and daily experiences. But the cosmopolitanism and cultural hybridization that al-Janfawi longs for requires meaningful and repeated contact, the slow experience of living, working, and playing with others. People need to experience negotiating diversity and difference rather than associating only with people like themselves or people they like. So rather than the suburb or the shopping mall, which typify sameness and conformity, I argue that the city, with its inherent diversity and multiplicity, is the primary place to experiment with encountering and confronting such difference, particularly in unplanned urban spaces that encourage functional diversity and social exploration. And so this is why I believe that the damage is not irreparable. Kuwait's eroded urbanity may be salvaged through a restoration of a right to the city, which again not only entails spatial centrality, so desuburbanization, but also a right to participate in a vibrant and spontaneous urban life. And as I show in the conclusion of my book, Kuwait today is witnessing a demand for just such a restored right to the city by various social forces, political protesters, small business owners, civil society actors, architects, and regular residents and activists who are claiming their right to use the spaces of the city in unrestricted and uncontrolled ways, to participate in the production of a city more after their own heart's desires, and to experience the kind of vibrant and varied urban life that oil modernization began to erase 65 years ago. So for the remainder of my talk today, I'd like to discuss a few of these groups who I believe are demanding such rights to the city today, beginning with political opposition forces, who began taking to the streets in mass public demonstrations in 2011. Now, although the opposition was protesting against the Prime Minister for alleged political and financial corruption and was not explicitly addressing urban issues, the demonstrations represented, I believe, a public desire to lay claim to the city for political purposes. After independence in 1961, the city center was transformed into a controlled landscape of state power in which political contestation and public protest was rare. It was no longer the space of political discussion and debate as it had been in the pre-oil era, because the spaces that once gave form to the urban public sphere, diwaniyas and civil society organizations, had been shifted to the suburbs. So diwaniyas, which you see down here, are semi-public gatherings held in private homes since well before the coming of oil, in which men, but also increasingly now women, meet to discuss political and economic issues, to check the power of the ruling family, and of course to socialize. And because they're attached to the home, once the residents of the town were moved out to the suburbs, the Diwaniya went with them to the suburbs. And so in December 2010, a political gathering of anti-government activists held in the private Diwaniya of an opposition leader was raided by government special forces, which is very unusual. And in early 2011, just as thousands of demonstrators were convening on Tahrir Square in Cairo and Pearl Roundabout in Manama, Kuwait's youth-based opposition planned to hold a public demonstration in Sahet al-Safat, the historic public town square, which before oil the historic public town square before oil, which after oil was transformed into a modern plaza in the 1980s. It's also the image that's on the cover of my book. As-Safat is located in the heart of the central business district and is partly a traffic circle where multiple main roads meet. So though some small protests occurred there that January, the first public demonstrations in As-Safat since the Arab nationalist protests of the 1950s, before the movement gained momentum, the government swiftly cordoned off the plaza, and the municipality eventually announced plans for the site's 3 million dinar 2-year renovation. And so the protesters were forced to restrict their activities to a stretch of grass facing the Parliament building between the entrance to a heritage village and a large parking lot, which was easier to control as there's only one access road to the space. And so this space, which the opposition renamed Irada, or Determination Square, became the site of numerous public demonstrations over the following 2 years, used by political groups of all leanings, not just those opposed to the government. So despite the closure of Sahat al-Safat and the continuous government efforts to restrict mass rallies and demonstrations in the city in recent months, Irada restored a historic function to the city center, public politics, after decades of being relegated to the periphery. And now political activists of all stripes are no longer content to voice their demands in the privatized world of the suburbs. And so Irada has become a spatial symbol of a public demand not only for political, economic, and social equality, but also for the right to occupy the central spaces of power to make those demands. So nonetheless, the protesters' claim on the city are somewhat incidental to their political demands. They're staking a right to the city almost unconsciously. At the other extreme is a group whose demands for rights to the city are much more direct, deliberate, and conscious. And these are young local architects and intellectuals who have been engaging in a critical urban discourse over the past few years, arguably for the first time in Kuwait since the advent of oil. And so one group, known as the Arabana Project, for instance, which was established in 2010, has worked towards increasing public participation in urban planning in various ways. So organizing focus groups on behalf of the municipality in connection to various projects, hosting, this is more pictures of Irada. Hosting town hall meetings on subjects such as public housing and so on. And so this is all very new for Kuwait, having these kinds of public discussions on urban issues. And another group is Medina, a team of 5 young women architects who curate alternative walking tours of the city. And the purpose behind their tours is to get residents out of their cars and onto the streets, and to become more familiar with the built environment from which they have largely been estranged since the move to the suburbs and the privatization of everyday experiences after oil. And the tours are sometimes given by guest guides who share their own understandings and experiences of the spaces they traverse and explore on the tour. So some tours explore the hidden and unexpected parts of particular neighborhoods. Others focus on a particular theme, such as a tour conducted by a local chef that explores the city's fish markets and other food-related spaces before ending with a meal at his own restaurant. And still others take participants, mostly middle-class suburbanites, to the vibrant shops, squares, and back-alley restaurants frequented mostly by the city's predominantly South and Southeast Asian residents. And so each tour aims to give its participants a different experience of the city than what they would normally encounter in their daily routines. And the goal is to make people feel more connected to their city, in the hopes that they'll feel more inclined to become active participants in the production, maintenance, and governance of their built environment, and that they will demand something better than what the past 65 years of oil urbanization has brought. And although I cannot necessarily attribute this specifically to Medina's efforts, there has recently been a much greater public concern for the state of the built environment over the past couple of years. So for instance, Mantaqa Mi is a new volunteer project that leads local residents in cleaning up public spaces in their neighborhoods like parks, as well as common parts of the city like underpasses and public squares. And again, this is all very new, this kind of civic engagement with the city. And perhaps the clearest evidence of a budding desire for a new kind of urban experience in Kuwait is the growing popularity of the city center as a place for small local businesses. The establishment of homegrown cafes, restaurants, shops, art galleries is a new trend among young Kuwaitis that began around the mid-2000s. And many of these young business owners are unable to afford the high rents and overhead of shopping malls. and besides which many don't want to open in privatized complexes. And so the city center has offered a viable, affordable, and experiential alternative that young entrepreneurs have capitalized on, and they're revitalizing the city center in ways that no previous state-led attempt has been able to achieve. The trend started here in 2005 when a couple of young businesses moved into a dilapidated strip of shops along the Gulf Road. And the original shop sold fishing and sailing equipment catering to the nearby port and Dow harbors, but in the late 80s most of the harbors were moved, and so the shops declined. And so when these new businesses started moving in, the area was renovated and became Kuwait City's first example of unplanned urban gentrification. And the area's success drew attention to the city center as a potential haven for small business owners, particularly given the presence of old buildings with cheaper rents. And so over the past few years, several formerly derelict areas have been revitalized, with citizens rather than the municipality or private developers taking the lead in cleaning up, renovating, and transforming parts of the city into these trendy young new districts. Now, the potential effects of such citizen-led projects are mixed. Although spontaneous rather than planned developments, these gentrified districts are highly commercialized and remain the purview of the social elite. Most of the cafes and restaurants are unaffordable to the majority of expatriates who live and work in the city, who are predominantly migrant workers. Their main clientele are Kuwaitis who work in the central business district during the day and visit on their lunch breaks. But for the first time in decades, they're also luring middle-class Kuwaitis out of their suburbs and shopping malls into the city at night and on weekends. Now, and although some of these new areas feel clearly segregated from the surrounding city, which again, since the 70s have been predominantly occupied by low-income migrant workers, I'll point out this is one of these new areas, these new plazas here. And as you walk through this corridor right here, you open out onto this other square. This is a very middle-class, predominantly Kuwaiti area, and this is a migrant worker, predominantly Southeast Asian area. And they're just separated by this one little corridor. So some of these areas do feel very segregated from the surrounding city. However, young Kuwaiti suburbanites are coming into much closer proximity to and more regular contact with different kinds of people and ways of living. And members of these social worlds, these separate social worlds, now increasingly penetrate the spaces occupied by the other as they move through the city, particularly because parking is scarce and people actually have to walk through the city to reach their destinations, another relatively alien concept in Kuwait. So without over-romanticizing the point, the gap between Kuwaitis and non-Kuwaitis, the rich and the poor, the bureaucrat and the laborer, does shrink tremendously inside the city, much more so than in the suburbs or the shopping mall, making these businesses potentially important hubs for the growth of a new urbanity. Now, arguably the strongest current claim to public rights to the city in Kuwait is a community gardening project known as the Secret Garden, kick-started in September 2014 by a young woman named Maryam al-Nisab. Bored with her suburban lifestyle and craving, as she put it, a real experience, Maryam, her mother, and a small group of friends began cleaning up a run-down garden close to her family home in Salmiya. They dug a compost pit in one sector, built picnic tables and benches in another, and planted another large sector with a variety of vegetables, herbs, plants, flowers, and so on. And Salmiya is one of Kuwait's only mixed areas, combining residential, commercial, educational, and bureaucratic uses. And though the majority of its residents are non-Kuwaitis living in rented accommodation, some parts of the district contain Kuwaiti-owned villas. And as a community project, the garden has started to bridge that gap between Salmiya's otherwise segregated national and non-national residents. So for instance, Maryam lives in the neighborhood with her mother and grandmother. Let's see if this will play. Just a bit. But it was only through the garden that they became friends with a group of Arab women who lived nearby in an older building adjacent to the space. They had never actually met or crossed that divide before. Now, when they saw the space being renovated, various residents of the neighborhood, from young children to elderly women, immediately got involved. So, for instance, a South Asian laborer who lives in the area now regularly turns the compost pit. An American landscape architect who stumbled on the project while walking home one day volunteers regularly with his own technical expertise, and even the local businesses are getting involved. So nearby takeaway restaurants and juice shops donate their food scraps for the compost pit, while even there's a physiotherapist, a sports clinic next door, and the physiotherapists sometimes lead the volunteers in stretches and exercises after a long day of gardening. And so this once derelict space has been completely revived and is now used at different times of day by different people. Neighborhood children play there, teenagers hang out there at night to smoke and play cards, employees of the area eat on the benches during their lunch break, and so on. And every other Saturday, the volunteers hold a small-scale food market in the garden, using the fees the vendors pay to sustain their activities. And the vendors are of mixed nationalities and backgrounds, as are the members of the public who attend, many of whom wander in from the neighborhood. And so the garden is perhaps Kuwait's only current example of unplanned cooperative urbanism. No single group controls the space, and all have equal rights of access to it. And in a city where urban space is highly privatized, commercialized, and controlled, it's a rare public space of the kind that Andy Merrifield describes as, quote, a vibrant open public forum full of lived moments and enchanting encounters, end quote. As a final example that occurred actually after my book went to print, in early February it was announced that Beit Lodhan, a large pre-oil courtyard house that for decades has served as a community arts center, was going to be demolished to make way for, wait for it, another shopping mall. Now, demolition is a common occurrence, urban reality in Kuwait, where buildings rarely last more than 30 years before being knocked down. And for the most part, the destruction of the built environment has never been something that has aroused much public concern. A 2014 demonstration to stop the demolition of the iconic Modernist Chamber of Commerce building only drew about 15 people, mostly architects, and me, if you can find me in there. And it was not successful in saving the building. So I was surprised when news of Beit Lodhan's impending demolition created a public uproar. An online petition to save the space received thousands of signatures within the first few hours. And protest gatherings like this one have been attracting large numbers of people at the site regularly over the past few weeks. Now, Beit Lodhan is home to a variety of cultural activities. It holds free public classes in art, photography, and film. It provides a large rent-free space to a volunteer-based used bookstore, and its courtyards are used for free public performances and exhibitions. And it's also home to the Lodhan Youth Achievement Center, or LOYAC, which is an NGO dedicated to empowering youth, significantly Kuwaitis and non-Kuwaitis, by, quote, helping them find their sense of purpose by extending themselves to others. So Beit Lodhan is more than just a historic building. It's one of the few places that people of all backgrounds actively use and enjoy without any hint of commercialism involved, an unconventional space that is truly public and diverse. And the unprecedented public outrage against its demolition, and particularly that it is to be replaced by yet another mall, demonstrates that people really crave these kinds of spaces of public interaction in Kuwait. And this is a clear example of a demand for a reclaimed right to the city in Lethafrian terms, the right to participate in a richer, more fulfilling, and uncommodified urban life. To date, it's unclear what Beit Lodhan's fate will be. The latest update from friends in Kuwait is that government agencies are now trying to stop the demolition. But the state's response to all this activity has been missed. So to conclude, I'd like to just go over that a little bit. So on the one hand, the reaction to the protesters' convergence on the city was more contentious and obstructive, closing down Sahat Safat, using roadblocks to restrict access to Irada, using tear gas to disperse demonstrators, and so on. But on the other hand, over the past year, a new space has opened in Kuwait City that represents the state's first attempt at encouraging broader participation in the management and governance of public space. This is Al Shahid Park, located in the space that separates the city from the suburbs. It's a 200,000 square meter landscaped urban green space developed by the Diwan Amiri, the ruler's office, containing botanical gardens, historical and environmental museums, walkways and jogging tracks, a multi-purpose auditorium, an amphitheater, and so on. And once completed in 2015, the Diwan handed over the management of the park to LOYAC, that same youth group, in order to give young people the opportunity to, quote, help cultivate and nurture the arts, history, and culture by organizing events in the park. Now, there is a possible political connection between Irada and Al Shahid Park, because in the wake of the highly contentious political opposition movement of 2011, the Kuwaiti government made a more concerted effort to engage Kuwaiti youth in the political process in order to discourage them from joining opposition forces. So a Kuwaiti youth project was formed to give young people the opportunity to identify what they saw as the country's biggest problems and then to come up with solutions to be presented to the ruler. And this was considered a preferred method to voice their concerns rather than taking their grievances to Irada. And so Al-Shahid Park similarly gives Kuwaiti youth a sense of participation and engagement, but in a much more secure and controllable space than Irada. And it must be noted that the renovated Sahat al-Safat reopened at the same time as Al-Shahid Park in early 2015, but the historically open public space is now gated and locked at all times and may only be used for official events or with prior state permission. But while it may therefore be tempting to view these government attempts at co-opting the youth somewhat cynically, the fact remains that many young people are getting involved in decision-making. And I can elaborate a little bit more on that later on, but I'm realizing I'm going over my time. But another thing that I've been noticing over the past year is that these bottom-up groups are altering the normally indifferent and uncooperative attitude of state institutions towards public requests that fall outside the scope of existing laws. So, for instance, the Secret Garden's bi-monthly food market, which is extremely small and serves as a way for the volunteers to make a bit of money to sustain their activities, faced obstacles from government departments due to the law restricting the use of state-owned land for commercial purposes. And so food and farmers markets in general have been growing in popularity in Kuwait, like everywhere else. But the absence of a permit system facilitating the use of public space has forced these markets to function in private spaces, defeating the purpose of a public street market. So, for instance, the popular Qut market that takes place once a month was first held on the top floor of a parking garage of a private mall in the city, then moved to a new outdoor commercial development, and now has finally settled in the outdoor space of a private residential complex. And similarly, the food truck craze has also become popular in Kuwait. And like street markets, food trucks get people out of the private spaces of the city, like offices, shopping malls, and restaurants, and make them engage directly with the city's streets and public spaces, and therefore with the diverse people who use those spaces. But again, the country's laws restricting commercial activity on public land means that food trucks can only operate on private property, like universities, or at private events, like this motorsport event. Nonetheless, the growing pressure from these diverse new youth-based initiatives is slowly forcing state authorities to revisit many of the country's archaic licensing laws. So after much persistence, sorry to everyone who doesn't speak Arabic, but the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries finally agreed to let the Secret Garden legally hold their market, an unprecedented step that loosens the control over how people can use public space in Kuwait, while new policies are currently being developed to facilitate home and mobile businesses like food trucks. So to conclude, a community gardening project, street food markets, neighborhood improvement groups, city walking tours, though on their own some of these initiatives might seem trivial or insignificant, I argue that collectively these largely youth-based movements have the potential to counter the de-urbanizing tendencies of decades of top-down planning. Such bottom-up initiatives set Kuwait somewhat apart from other Arab Gulf cities like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha. Although it seems ostensibly as though Kuwait, once the regional leader in oil modernization and urban development from the 50s to the 80s, has fallen behind its southern neighbors in recent decades, Kuwait's urban circumstances are very different from those of cities like Dubai and Doha. Although planning has been a centralized and top-down process in Kuwait as it is elsewhere across the region, since 1963, Kuwait has had the Gulf's only popularly elected parliament that is a lawmaking rather than a consultative body. And so, as in any country where major national projects and decisions must be approved through a legislative process rather than decreed from above, development is much slower in Kuwait than it is elsewhere. And although some argue that this puts Kuwait at a disadvantage in what seems to have become a regional competition to be the biggest, tallest, richest, or most ostentatious, I believe that the slowdown in Kuwait's state-led development, coupled with its deeper history of socio-political contestation and participation, has created the space for these civic groups to envision a more sustainable urban development model for the region than the rapid, radical, and state-led development that has guided Kuwait's development and continues to guide the region's development since the advent of oil. And restoring a right to the city is not an end in itself. It's a step towards a bigger goal. And as Amin and Thrift argue, quote, the city is more than a place of common access and encounter. It is a place of becoming and the fulfillment of social potential, of democratic experimentation through the efforts of citizens themselves. And so these newly emerging initiatives and groups, although seemingly inconsequential individually, collectively point to a possible urban alternative for Kuwait that has the potential to not only save the city, but also to solve some of the social crises I described earlier, and perhaps salvage Kuwait's primordial quality of urbanity. Thank you.